So first, let me just introduce myself if you don't know who I am. So I'm Steve Lee. I'm the software engineer manager for the PowerShell team. I also own the PowerShellGallery, OpenSSH, a bunch of modules, stuff like the VSCode extension. I guess a little bit of history. So I've been, come January, I've been at Microsoft for 23 years. So for me, that's a long time. But it's been a good roller coaster ride. I mean, there's been ups and downs. I've been under 3 different CEOs. I started on the WMI team. And then I spent, I actually was part of the WinRM team when that was conceived, went through that whole exercise. I was part of the team that did the sysinternals acquisition. And then I was also part of the team where Microsoft acquired NetIQ, which later became MOM, Microsoft Operations Manager, which later was renamed as SCOM, System Center Operations Manager. So I went through that whole thing before ending onto the PowerShell team and then taking over as we took it open source. So that's kind of like a little bit of my history. I also mentioned that I do have a bunch of content. It's mostly going to be demos today. So if you have any questions, please wait till the end. So take a note, ask me towards the end. I'll also be popping in and out at the Microsoft booth throughout the day, and I'm able to answer questions about any topic that you want. So why don't we get started on, let's see, I'm going to RDB to my Windows machine here. All right, let me double check. All right, so the topic for today is really just about PowerShell 7 and specifically PowerShell 7.3. So this is the release that we're still working on. It's almost done. And I'm just going to cover like really highlight some of the highlights on what's new. I'm not covering every little detail. We got a lot of contributions from the community and also from the team. So you have to look at the release notes if you want to see exactly what the changes are. So for 7.3, one of the bigger things is we are staying aligned with .NET. So this is built on .NET 7. We expect to have a release candidate next month. And if all goes well, pending customer feedback, user feedback, we do want to hit general availability in November, which means that it'll be, so even the release candidate will be what we call go live. So we support it in production. So we do hope that some folks do exercise that. And if you have issues, we will service that before we actually call GA, which is done. But we will have servicing releases, of course, 7.3.1 and whatever as needed if there are issues that come up. So and I'm using my little script here to kind of remind me of what I need to cover. Okay, so the first thing I want to cover is this what's new. So one of the things we came to realize is that we have all these frequent releases, and we still do preview releases every month, and we have major releases every year. And by the way, there is no plan for PowerShell 8. It's going to be PowerShell 7 unless we feel a real big need to have a major big break and change and go to PowerShell 8. But one of the challenges we've seen is like people aren't always aware of what all the new things are and how to leverage them, why it would help them be more productive. So one of the new modules and commands that we decided to have is this get what's new. So this is not actually part of PowerShell 7 itself, all right? But this is published on the gallery. And you can use it for also older versions of PowerShell 7. I believe it also works in PowerShell 5.1, although it won't give you information about PowerShell 5.1. So I already have it installed here. So if I just run it. And it is actually aware that I am, in this case, this PowerShell on top here is running PowerShell 7.2 because I'm going to use this later as a comparison between 7.3 and 7.2. But this tells you like, what was new for 7.2. So if I switch over here, so this is 7.3 preview 8. And I'll explain the little blue text later if you're not aware of what that is. So this shows content for 7.3. And the great thing here is this actually was not a huge amount of work for the team to build. So when I did the online switches, it actually took us to the browser page where we already had this content. So our content team already produces the what's new content. You can kind of see it here. So basically, we kind of just wrapped a commandlet around this and have it rendered as text, so you can get that information through the console. So this is also an open source project. Here's the repo up here. So as you're using this, if you have suggestions for new features or if there's bugs, please report them or submit pull requests. And this is what we want to continue to enhance as a way to get information. And hopefully in the future, we can also support modules, potentially third-party integration. But these are all things being discussed. Now, as far as PowerShell 7.3 itself, the major theme for us was really focusing on the shell. So I think PowerShell as a scripting language, we did a bunch of work earlier in earlier releases to really improve that. But I think the area that still needed work was just the shell itself, specifically around the use of native commands. One of the big aha moments for me was I was asked to review some scripts within Microsoft, and I saw that they were using start process as a way to execute a native command, and it was just surprising to me. They were not doing anything advanced where that they needed to do that. It just seemed like maybe they weren't aware that you could just call a native command just like you would a commandlet, or there were some other technical problems, and some of these problems we're going to cover and how we resolve them. So the first thing is argument passing. So let me go back to 7.2 first to show the current behavior. And by the way, the behavior in 7.2 will be the same behavior that you see in 7.1, 7.0, and also Windows PowerShell 5.1. So let me first set up my environment here. And just to show you what all this is doing is just setting up an executable that I wrote, a very small one called echo args, into my path. And I'll show that here. So this is C#. All it does is for every argument that it receives, it's just going to write it back out, right? So it shows you exactly what it's receiving. So with the way that Windows PowerShell worked, due to limitations in the .NET API, it basically has to pass all the arguments that you provide as a single string to an executable. And so we have to parse everything, and then if there's white space, we have to put it in quotes. And so some of that doesn't work out exactly right. So let me show you this first one here. So what you would probably, or what you'd want to expect to happen, so again, echo args is just an executable that I wrote, is that I'm sending a single quote, double quote, A space B, double quote, single quote. So what you'd want to happen is that the double quotes inside are part of the argument that should be passed. But instead, it shows like all the quotes got removed, right? So this is actually incorrect. So if you wanted to pass in double quotes, or if you reverse it, so you have the double quotes on the outside, single quote on the inside, you would actually not get that. So if I do the same thing here, so this is, again, when I switch to the bottom one, this is 7.3. And let me also set up my environment, and then I can run the same thing. You can see like, this has now been fixed because now we're not going to do all this additional parsing. We actually parse, or actually pass. The reason it's called argument passing is that each individual argument is now passed as part of an array to a .NET API, so it actually handles it more correctly. So that's one example. Let me switch back here. So here's another example of a problem that users were having. So in this case, I'm not trying to pass single quotes as part of the argument. The single implies that I actually want to pass an empty string as an argument. So what the current behavior is, or previous behavior, is that all this got removed and you're only passing two arguments, right? So if you're using something like get and you have a message parameter and you want to pass an empty string, which is not a good practice, but let's say you wanted to do it, you would actually have a hard time passing an empty string because if this argument just get removed completely. But if I run this under with the changes that have been made, you can see that there's actually 4 arguments, which is the right thing, and these are empty strings. An additional enhancement that was added as part of this work was now the parameter binder will actually tell you via the trace commandlet, like what is actually being bound to those commands. So this is a good way to kind of determine if something doesn't work out correctly. You can use this as a way to see, hey, what is PowerShell intending to pass? Because maybe you have something very complex with different escaping and all that. So the thing I also want to bring up is there's different modes now. So up here I indicate there's legacy, standard, and Windows modes. Legacy is basically what you would get in Windows PowerShell 5.1 or PowerShell 7.0, 7.1, or 7.2. So it kind of falls back to the previous behavior. This is needed if you have, for some reason, scripts that don't work under these changes and you need it for compatibility. You can set this at the top of your script, and the way that arguments get passed to native commands will be the same as it was before. So let me just show you this real quick under the 7.3. So with standard mode, for example, CMD has interesting behavior. So one of the things that is a big difference between Windows and non-Windows is on Unix type systems, they actually do parsing of arguments in a consistent way. whereas on Windows, it's up to the library used by native commands. So CMD uses an older one versus if you're using like the new C++ compiler, it'll work differently. But basically what's happening is that for this to work under standard, which is the default for Mac OS and Linux, is that if there's double quotes that need to get passed, they have to get escaped, right? So in this case, when PowerShell sees this, it's going to escape these arguments, but CMD doesn't know what to do with this, so you see the literal / still there. So this is incorrect from a compatibility perspective with CMD. So we created this Windows mode, which is the default on Windows. And basically what this does is we have a hard-coded list of commands that we know we want to maintain basically legacy. We fall back to legacy behavior, and CMD, batch files, VBScript, JScript, Windows Script Host, things like that are all applicable. And so now with Windows mode, then other commands like git, Docker, kube control, stuff like that will work under standard. So it gets what it probably expects. And then we have this other list. So if you have any issues here where you have a legacy command or even a newer command that is using a weird argument parsing library on Windows, then open up issues and we can add those to the list. All right, error handling is also another area with native commands that kind of breaks the PowerShell experience for users. So okay, I can just show it here as well. So net share is just going to get information about a share I have on the system. I'm going to just do ABC because the share actually doesn't exist on this computer, so it's going to fail. And so what you would normally do if you had like this type of command in your script is you would check LASTEXITCODE. And actually, I found a bug here that I need to fix. So this should have been a 2. It's actually turned -1. So if I run the same thing in 7.2, I'll get this fixed before 7.3 codes out. So LASTEXITCODE is a built-in automatic variable, but this returns the error code that returned from the executable. All right. And so when you're writing your script and you're using native commands, typically you would have to check LASTEXITCODE after execution to see whether the last command succeeded or failed. You can't use the normal commandlet error action preference to do this. So the change here is really this other new feature, which is the PS native command use error action preference. So what this does, if you set the true, by default it's going to be false. So again, you can put this at the top of your script, is now when a native command fails, and failure means exit code is non-zero. So just to be clear, not every native command uses non-zero as failure. There are some, for example, like choice and stuff like that, where it's going to return a non-zero result and it's still success. So you need to handle this within your script. But now what this means is that PowerShell is going to check the exit code for you, and if it's a non-zero, it's going to do the same thing as a commandlet failing. So it would be by default be a non-terminating error. So if I run the same command again, share, you'll see an additional error here, right? So this is actually a non-terminating error that's generated by the engine. If I could get error, I can see the details of it just like any other PowerShell error. There's like the path to the executable. There's the actual exit code, which should have been a 2 up there. And you also get the process ID. So if you now put error action preference stop at the top of your script because you want any failure in a commandlet, or if you, with this other feature turned on, any failure from native command, you just stop your script so you don't accidentally continue to run in a failure case, then now you can also catch these exceptions because these will be terminating errors now. You see here, again, all this text is being sent to std error from this command, so it'll still show up on the console. You can redirect std error if you need to capture it. But now you can treat these as though it was kind of like a commandlet in terms of error handling. There's some security improvements that I'm not going to demo. It's a bit complicated to set these up. So PowerShell has always had great security and great integration with security features in Windows specifically. So there's 2 additional enhancements that we made, and this does require a newer version of Windows, which has the enhancements in both AMSI, which is the anti-malware scan interface, and also WDAC, Windows Defender Application Control. So the first one, AMSI, is really any either using Windows Defender or a third-party virus malware scanner. It probably integrates with AMSI, which means that PowerShell can send pipelines and script blocks to it to determine whether or not it's something that it should or should not run. So the additional enhancements is really adding .NET method invocation logging. So when you're executing something like this, right, then you can have much more complex stuff here where you're trying to obfuscate what's being called. But PowerShell will now deobfuscate it and send it to the AMC interface to get additional detection whether or not this is something safe to run. For Windows Defender application control, currently, before they added this new feature, you could lock down your system, which means that even admins are constrained in what they can do. And by default, in any lockdown system with WDAC enabled, PowerShell will automatically be in constrained language mode, which limits what you can do. But that was not exactly what a lot of users wanted. So WDAC added this feature where you can actually have allow and block lists for scripts. And so now this is not just signing, but you can also have stuff like scripts by hash, or I believe it also allows you to have like a folder that is safe, and any scripts that exist in that folder can be allowed to run. So now PowerShell will respect that as well. All right, some interactive improvements. So when I start typing here, right, like git command or whatever, get some instance, you see like this blue text. This is actually part of a feature that we shipped, I think, in 7.1, I want to say, and continue to improve in 7.2, which is prediction. So this these lines here actually changes the color style. By default, it's going to be like a dark gray kind of color to make it less visual. So I changed it so that it made it more obvious. I personally prefer it, but the thing I want to actually show is this thing called completion predictor. So by default with PSReadline, you get a history predictor. So this is what's coming out of my history. This is a sample predictor. There's a GitHub repo. This is open source. This also serves as an example on how to build your own predictor. The only other major predictor that is out there that I'm aware of right now is for Azure PowerShell. So I'm going to show that in a second, but I want to explain two other lines here. So this one is for enabling both the history plugin, again, that comes with PSReadline, and also any plugins that are on the system. By default, PSReadline only enables history. And then I want the default style to be inline, which is what you see down here below. But I want to have this hotkey F2 to switch between inline view and list view, which I'm going to demo. So let me just run this here. And I already have this module installed on my system. Now, what completion predictor does is kind of like a enhanced version of tab completion. So let's do console, and then if I do F2, well, this is coming from my history, so that may not be here you can see some additional ones from completion. So this is going to be a mix. Basically, you can still do the old tab completion. You can also do the menu complete in PSReadline, but this gives you basically some of the options, not everything, because it won't fit on the screen, that you can do. So I can also do this against commandlets. So you can kind of see it's showing. So this might be a great way to kind of, see what parameters or properties or members are available very easily. Again, I have it bound to F2 here, which is not the default. So I can just switch between the two views. Because list view does take up more screen, so I'll turn that off for now. And this does also work with objects, which I'm going to skip because I don't want to run over time here. So next, I'm going to go over some of the new features that were in 7.3. The first one, I'm not going to demo because it's actually more for developers and I don't have something ready yet. It's very custom connection info. So in PowerShell remoting today, there's actually a large number of different transports or connection infos you can use. So the obvious ones that people are familiar with is like WSMAN, SSH. But there's also things like IPC, inter-process communication. There's name pipes. There's PowerShell Direct, things like that. So what this feature allows you to do is basically come up with your own. And the way this came about is we got some feedback from the community where, for SSH remoting today, we basically shell out to SSH-exe to handle the connection, and then we use student and studapp to transport the contents. And there was an ask to kind of expose some more of the SSH-exe switches to do more advanced things. But what we didn't want to do is bind ourselves to SSH-exe. Like in the future, maybe we'll switch to using an SSH library or something like that. So instead, we basically made a bunch of internal APIs public, so anyone can build their own connection info. So the way this would work, and I have a link to the RFC that has an example, and I think that we also have a repo, which I couldn't find it right now, with some sample code. So you can have your own commandlets. For example, it might be like new SSH session, and then internally you'll build this connection info object and you pass it back to PowerShell, and then PowerShell just use that for remoting. the one limitation to be aware of is there's no custom listener support. So you can still work around this by hosting PowerShell 7 yourself in your own executable, and then you handle the communication between those two. So you can do like a gRPC one, you could do RPC, you can, I don't know, HTTP, whatever you want. And you can publish those as modules on the PowerShell Gallery. All right, next I want to cover local session configuration. So for those who are not familiar with session configuration, this is really a feature that was leveraged by Gia, which is just enough administration. So I have a link here to this. It's an archive repo. We're not actively developing it, but it has a lot of information. Basically, what Gia provided was you could create a remote run space that people can connect to, and they'd be constrained on a particular role. So if they're like a printer admin, then you can limit them to commandlets that can only manage printers, for example. Or if they're like a web admin, you can limit stuff to IIS, things like that. One of the big challenges we had is that we were trying to push towards SSH as the preferred remoting protocol. However, a lot of the Gia features, which leverage session configuration, was actually built in WinRM. And so hopefully that'll come over time. So that's why I'm referring to this as Gia Lite. And I'm not going to go over the details of, I have a link to about session configuration files. You can read about it yourself. And this RFC describes this feature. But I want to go into the demo here. So the first one is I'm going to create a session configuration file. So there's this built-in command that's already there. Previously, it was only on Windows, but we've also enabled it for non-Windows because you can do this locally. So I'm creating this file called demo PSSC. I'm going to enable just 2 commandlets by default. So I'm saying that in this configuration, you have access to get command and get process. The language mode is going to be restricted. So it's going to basically be like a shell without scripting availability. I'm going to explain this in a little bit, exit session while that's there. This PS1 file just defines this function, the exit session function. And then the session type is going to be restricted remote server, which is probably what you want to use in most cases because the restricted remote server is actually going to add a bunch of proxy functions beyond the 2 that I have allowed, because through our experience, you need to have certain things available, otherwise you can't use it interactively. So let's create that, and you can see this is very much, it's a hash table, so it very much looks like a PSD1 file. And then in the PSSC PS1, all I'm doing here is creating this function called exit session, and all it does is call exit. And you need this if you're going to test this locally, otherwise you actually don't have a way to exit the session without killing the process. If you're doing this remotely, then remotely you can actually call exit. So let me just now go back here. So again, this is only going to be available in 7.3. So basically, we added this new parameter to pwsh-exe, and it's going to now use a session config file. I'm going to make sure I don't load my profile, which is going to be using a bunch of commandlets and commands that are not available. So here we go. And then if I do get command, you see that here's the 2 commandlets I have allowed. And these are all the proxy functions that get generated by the restricted remote server type. And again, we validated these to be safe to have. And these are limited versions of the actual commandlet. So these are not the actual commandlets you can call with all the parameters and whatnot. These are restricted versions. So here, if I do like, get process pwsh, then I can still run that. But if I were to try to do like get service, then obviously it'll be not found because it's not in this list because I've constrained it up here. So this is interesting for development purposes. And again, if I just type exit, this won't work here because it'll say any kind of scripting keywords I can't use within a restricted language session. That's why I had to do this exit session to get out of it. Okay. However, where this is going to be more interesting and more useful is with SSH, right? So here on line 103 here, I have an example of what you would put in your SSHD, the paths here on my MacBook, which I'm going to remote into in a second. But basically, you would set up just following the documentation that we have published. You follow, it means this is SSH server mode, no logo, no profile. And the only additional thing here is I'm going to point it to a configuration file, which is exactly the same one I have on this machine. So let me remote into that. Oh, actually, this first one is actually a full session. So kind of show the difference. Meaning that this is not constrained in any way. This is, if I run git command, you'll see like I have everything that I normally would if I was logged on locally. You can see a bunch of AZ stuff coming through. So this is a full session. But I did create a demo subsystem, which you can specify as here, like so. And this one will be the constrained one. So pretty much exactly the same as when I ran locally, but now this is doing remoting to my well, actually to my laptop I'm using right now. But in this case, exit will work because remoting handles this as a special case. Although exit session will still work. All right, so the next thing I want to show is clean block. So let's look at the script real quick. And this currently doesn't have the clean block in it because I want to show what happens today if you're not familiar with this. So this is a simple script. It takes input from the pipeline. It's just going to write when it enters the begin block. For every item that comes through, it's going to write a processing and whatever the input is. And then there's an end block, right? So if I just run this like so. Okay, so begin block ran once. I had 10 numbers piping through, so it ran 10 times, and then end block was run once. So I think in the past, users had a misconception that the end block gets run every time, and they could use that for cleanup, like closing a database connection or closing a connection of some sort, or removing temporary files. But that's not the case. Here, if I use select object to select just the first two objects that come out, then what's going to happen is that select object, after it gets what it needs, it's actually going to throw a special exception that stops the pipeline. When it stops the pipeline, the end block will not get executed, right? You can see that here. So what this clean block provides is actually now a way to do cleanup. Let's see, clean, if I type this right. Block. All right. If I rerun the same scenario, you can see like this clean block did get run. And by the way, this is in red because this extension is using PowerShell 7.2 to analyze, and that doesn't contain this keyword. So now this means that you can rely on clean block to do cleanup because it's guaranteed to run, right? So if I actually do the first one without killing the pipeline, you see that everything got run, right? So clean block will get run. So that's very useful. I guess I'll show the wait one real quick. Or did I? Oh, I actually removed it. I should have removed it from my script. This was originally just going to show that if you hit Control-C, then the clean block can still get run, but if you hit at the right or wrong time, depending on your perspective, it will still cancel execution of the clean block. All right, there's been some additional enhancements in PS style. So PS style was something we had introduced, I think, in PowerShell 7.1. Let me just show that by itself first. So this is how, going forward, you do declaration. You can see, like, a lot of the old private data has been moved here. So private data is really only exists for compatibility reasons. You should not be setting things there. Those will not be respected going forward. But you can see, a lot of the ANSI escape sequences are here, so you don't have to remember what these codes mean. You can just reference this. But the addition here is really about file info. So this allows just basically coloring of content to make it easier to visually differentiate if you just do, for example, dir, right? So now using these colors, these are the default colors. You can see like directory is now stand out. It's this white text on a blue background. PowerShell content is in yellow, and symbolic links are going to be the cyan color. Now, if you don't like the coloring or if you want to change it, then, so for example, let's change the directory one. So let's say you don't like that one. You can just go like this. So I'm going to make it foreground. Let's make it magenta, right? And now if I do dir, then it's going to be italic, bold, and magenta. So you can choose whatever you want and put it in your profile to have it set by default. And if you don't like the way these other colors work, which are extension based, then this is just a hash table. So you can just clear this whole thing. Clear. Right. Now this cleared all the colors, so these are all gone. So again, if you inspect this, you can see this is completely cleared out. But if you wanted to add something yourself, so let's make, here, I already have this in here. Let's make PS1 red. Then all the PS1s become red. So you can add whatever you want. You add it for your archives, for images, for music, whatever. So it's all up to you. Yes, I think I covered all that. All right, switch process. So I'm going to have to switch back to my MacBook to show switch process because this doesn't exist on Windows. So on Unix systems, it's very common for applications that need to create a process to expect that the shell has this exec command. So if I do get command exec, right, this is actually an alias to a command like called switch process. And this is pretty much needed on non-Windows systems for compatibility. So basically what happens is that, for example, VS Code might try to shell out to a debugger, and it's going to call exec first because it's going to rely on the default shell to set up the environment for like the path and all this stuff. But it doesn't want to have the shell hanging around. So what exec does is it's going to start a new process, and it's going to replace the process that started it, right? So to show that, the current process ID for this PowerShell that's running is 68929. So if I do exec Z shell, and if I do echo, so $$ is going to show the process ID. You can see it. This is the same process ID because this PowerShell that I had as the parent process doesn't exist anymore. It's not running anymore. It got replaced by Z shell. And if I exit, this is actually not going to exit me back into PowerShell. It's actually going to exit the terminal. So again, I think for most users, you may not have a need for this, but this is really there for compatibility with applications that expect exec to be a built-in command. Next, I'm going to just cover some specific bug fixes and updates that I think people should be aware of. So the first one here, let me just show this in 7.2. So you may or may not be aware, but there are times where if you're converting from JSON, you may have to do it as a hash table versus the default, which is a PS custom object, because JSON allows for the different properties to only differ by casing, right? So you can have one that's lowercase a, uppercase a, and PS custom object won't allow that because it's case insensitive. The thing you may notice down here is that although the JSON has a particular order, and it just happens in this case it's alphabetical, but it doesn't really matter. That's not a factor. What actually ends up in a hash table is it's a weird order, right? And it depends on how the hashes themselves get computed. So the change here is really to preserve. I'm going to save it as a variable because I'm going to show the type here. So the change here in 7.3 is to maintain that order. And the way we do it is we actually implemented a new type called ordered hash table. So this is actually derived from hash table, but internally is an ordered dictionary. And the reason we did that is we needed to actually have all of the same members and methods for a hash table implemented so it maintains compatibility. So it is a hash table. It just happens to be ordered. One thing they may have already seen, that this came from Keith Hill, that people have always complain about how much output comes out when you start PowerShell. So this is 7.2. You see the version, you got this copyright information, you got like URL, and tells you to type help for help, right? And I think over time, people said, hey, I don't need to see that every time. So the change that was made is really, hey, you know what? The only information people really need is to know the version of PowerShell that's starting. And you can always use no logo if you don't even want that, right? In this case, you won't see anything. You'll just see a prompt. But so now I should be like multiple PowerShells, but that was a great change. Here's a small one that I think is, I don't know how useful it's going to be, to be honest, but I think it's a good one for completeness and for it's making it a little bit more intuitive. So this came from Matthias, and basically start sleep currently does not allow you to pass a duration, meaning that if you do start sleep, you can do like seconds and minutes and stuff like that. But I think it's very natural to say, hey, I have this time span, right? And I just want to send that to start sleep. So here you can do that now, because now it will accept a time span, meaning a duration. So that's pretty neat. This one is, again, let me just show what happens today in 7.2. So let's say I have some objects that have a lot of decimals. So I have an example here, and they're by design here to have different number of decimal places. So what happens today is that, these are not aligned. If you have a lot of data, it can make it hard to do a visual comparison of these things. Maybe these are measurements of something. So the change here in 7.3 is that we now, for format table specifically, we respect the culture setting. So if you change this in your culture or set to a different culture, then you'll get different results. But on mine, which is English US, the number of decimal digits here is 2, right? So if I run the same command now on 7.3, then you see that it automatically gets truncated to 2 decimal places. This is only for formatting, so the object itself is not being modified. And if you do format list, you always get the full number of digits, right? So this is more for a table where you have maybe a lot of columns and a lot of rows. This will make it easier to see decimal information. This next one comes from Joel Sallow. So let's just take a look at this. So there are some .NET methods, and this will just show the signature, where it actually requires a type, right? And currently there's no way to do that through PowerShell syntax. You would actually have to do reflection to actually call these methods. So this was a nice change. So now, similar to if you had to provide type information as a parameter versus the method, you provide it inside the parentheses. But here, I'm able to call this now, and all this is going to do is generate a string array, right? So this actually worked. What this method does is create a string array, and I can also do it for other types, just as an example. So I can do it for int. And if I get a number on this successfully created a integer array. So this will allow you to actually call methods now that require type information, generic methods. All right, this next one may require a little bit more explanation of what it is. This comes from Ilya, who is our community maintainer. So let me just get, so this is WMI related. So logical disk here is going to get, I only have one hard drive on this particular system, but for example, on this column drive type, you see the number 3, right? And you may not know what this number 3 means, but the WMI class actually has that information, although it is what's called an amended qualifier. And what that means is that here, this is showing like, as part of the qualifiers, it actually doesn't have this amended qualifier. So let me show it first and I'll explain what this means. So the new change here is adding this -amended switch to get sim class. So if you look here, it's missing, description, and it's also missing values. And the reason these are missing is that these qualifiers are actually localizable. So although it's going to show up in English here, they could be in Spanish, French, Chinese, whatever the case may be. So because they're localizable, they actually don't show up by default. You actually have to do amended for these to show up. So now if you were to inspect the amended values, right, you can see like, and this is this happens to be like an array. So index 0, 1, 2, 3, this will be local disk. So this will show, so here I'm just going to capture that particular disk into this variable, and then I'm going to use that derived type as a way to index into this array of qualifiers. And it should tell me again, that 3 means it's a local disk, right? So now you could actually have like a proxy function that you wrap to show, as long as these qualifiers exist, you can show like the enum value into the enum name. And that's actually the end of all the demos. Let me quickly cover what's going to happen, what we're going to be working on next from a PowerShell perspective. So we're going to be starting work on PowerShell 7.4. I'm hoping that we'll have a preview 1 of 7.4 aligned with the release candidate of 7.3. So that'll hopefully be next month. Although it won't initially start with .NET 8 because I think the first build of .NET 8 won't come until next year. So it'll still be on .NET 7. But at least we can get a lot of the changes that's happened since we branched off for 7.3. 7.3 is a non-LTS release, meaning that it's supported for 1 year, but PowerShell 7.4, so every even number is going to be LTS, long-term servicing. So this will be supported for 3 years, and our target is to have this available by end of next calendar year. So now I do have about 6 minutes or so for any questions. So feel free, and I've not been monitoring the chat, by the way. So I'll take a look at that later, and I can answer in chat later. But if there's any questions that you want to bring up during the presentation, just come up to the Q&A area. Otherwise, as a reminder, I will be popping in and out at the Microsoft booth in between meetings that I still have today to answer any questions about any topic that you want to talk about.
So if anyone wants to come, so I know Jay had a question about, why is there a reason between for the name clean instead of finally?
Yes, that's a good question. So that was a big debate that we had in the committee, and we also, I think we had a discussion also we got some feedback from the community as well, and also some other engineers on the team who are not in the committee. I think the problem with finally is that it's a very it sets this wrong expectation with developers, because you have try finally, and so in the finally block, we wanted to actually make this work more like how PowerShell blocks work, like process, end, and begin, in terms of how they work with Control-C, like if you try to break the script. And finally has a different contract than what ended up being clean. So that's why we deliberately didn't want to call it finally, because it sets the wrong expectation with C# developers.
Another question was, any other case like select where the end block isn't executed?
Oh, good question. I am not aware off the top of my head. I mean, if you hit Control-C in the pipeline, that will have the same effect, meaning that any commands within the pipeline, their end blocks won't get run, but all of their clean blocks will get a chance to run. Select is just an obvious one, because what you don't want, if you didn't have this behavior, you don't want to say, I'm going to pipe 1,000 objects through and I want to choose the first 2. Then select would have to wait for the other 998 to go through before it actually finishes. So the optimization is say, hey, I got what you wanted. I'm going to cancel the pipeline. There's no need to continue processing.
So if there's any other question, people can just come in the Q&A area and ask them. That's the only ones that were available in the Q&A part of the chat.
Oops. Oh, yep. Hey.
Hello. Do you have any other improvements regarding process, starting a new process plant? Like, I know we're fighting at least with few things, like streaming out the output from the process, capturing it easily, doing that in PowerShell. We have like our own wrapper written in .NET just to be able to do this.
Is this related to binary output?
I think we're capturing like the standard output and the error output, and we are having trouble like just starting an external executable, giving it the parameters so they survive the hop, and getting the results in an easy way, so it's not very obvious, and we run into many bugs around this.
So if you, okay, so let me, so this is not being addressed in 7.3, but it's something we want to fix in 7.4. One specific case. I don't know if this is a case you're referring to, so maybe we can also talk offline to understand exactly what challenges you're having. But basically, if you just start a regular executable today, you can use the greater than sign to redirect, and then you can put a number in front of it to redirect specific streams. 1 for stood out, 2 for stood error, stuff like that. So all that should work for like, let's say 80% of the time. That should just work. The one case that we're aware of that should work but doesn't work and has never worked in PowerShell since PowerShell 1.0 is when you do redirection from a native command, PowerShell, because of how .NET works, by default, will always try to convert to text. So if you, for example, do something like, a classic thing would be curl pipe to like tar to expand it. And if you do invoke web request or invoke REST method, in this case, pipe to expand archive, that won't work because during the conversion to text, you will lose some of the bits and bytes. So it's not going to be valid binary anymore. So that is a PR that Patrick on a team, I believe, has already had a work in progress posted. So hopefully that'll show up in 7.4 early to at least cover that specific case.
Okay, thanks. I will try to replicate what you described. Maybe we're just doing it wrong or in maybe a way too complicated way.
Yeah, feel free to follow up with me on that. I want to, and anyone else, by the way, if I want to make sure like PowerShell, people should be able to use PowerShell as a shell. So whatever you're doing in Bash or Z Shell or even CMD, if that equivalent thing you have a challenge doing in PowerShell, let me know, open up issues. We want to resolve those things. We want to make it more intuitive and reduce the number of surprises people get, unless they're positive surprises.
Perfect, thanks.